You know, in our world of constant updates, endless feeds, and nonstop news alerts, it can feel like you're trying to drink from a fire hose of information. But have you ever stopped to think about who's actually building that hose, and more importantly, where they're pointing it? Today, we're going to explore the invisible architecture that shapes what you believe.
We've all been there, right? You're watching a news report about a protest, and on one channel, it's a passionate cry for justice. Then you flip to another channel, and the exact same event is being shown as a dangerous, destructive riot. The basic facts haven't changed, so what gives?
The answer, it turns out, isn't just about the facts themselves. It's about a powerful concept that shapes our reality way more than we realize. It's called the frame. It's not about what is being said, but how it's being said. And to really get how these frames are built, we first need to look at the raw materials people use, especially when those materials aren't exactly true.
So let's start with a kind of field guide to the different flavors of false information out there. Because, look, before we can see the architecture of a story, we've got to be able to identify the bricks it's built from. Okay, first up, the most fundamental distinction you need to know. Misinformation versus disinformation. Think of misinformation as an honest mistake. A rumor that gets out of control or just a simple error in reporting. Disinformation, though, that's a different beast entirely. It's a lie, and it's crafted with the deliberate intent to deceive you. One's an accident, the other is a weapon.
Now, if we go to the most extreme end of the spectrum, you get fabricated content. This is the stuff that is just made up, completely from scratch. It's a total fantasy, built from the ground up with one goal: to fool you.
And this is where things get a little more sophisticated. Imposter content basically hijacks your trust. It'll wrap itself in the logo and branding of a news source you know and respect, making a flat-out lie look like a totally legitimate report. Super sneaky.
Oh, and this one is everywhere. False context. This is when someone takes a real photo, or a real video, or a real quote, and just plops it into the wrong story. So the little piece of content itself is genuine, but the narrative it's being used to support is completely false.
Right when we thought we were getting a handle on these classic tricks, artificial intelligence came along and just changed the entire game. Synthetic media, or AI-generated content, has taken the potential for deception to a whole new, kinda scary level.
So let's quickly run through some of these modern tools. Of course, we have deepfakes, which can make it look like someone said or did something they absolutely never did. And then you've got speech synthesis, which can create a terrifyingly realistic copy of their voice saying it. But it's not just about fake content. It's also about manipulating the conversation itself, with things like sock puppets, fake online accounts pretending to be real people, and seal lining, which is a bizarre form of harassment that just tries to drown a debate in a sea of bad faith questions.
Okay, so those are the blunt instruments of deception, the outright lies and manipulations. But what about when the facts of a story are true? Well, the most powerful kind of persuasion doesn't even need falsehoods. It relies on something way more subtle. And this brings us to the core concept of our whole discussion: the framing effect. This classic definition by Robert Ettman really nails it. Now, notice the key words here. Framing isn't about lying, it's about selecting. It is the art of choosing which parts of reality to highlight, to make them seem more important, or as he says, salient, to gently guide you toward a very specific conclusion.
I love this analogy because it makes it so clear. Just imagine reality is this huge, chaotic theater stage, filled with actors and props and a million things happening at once. A frame is the spotlight. It doesn't add anything new to the stage, but by shining brightly on just one corner, it makes you totally ignore everything else happening in the shadows.
And believe me, this is not some newfangled idea. The concept of framing has some really deep roots. It all started back in sociology with Erving Goffman, who saw frames as these mental shortcuts we all use to make sense of a complicated world. Then in psychology, the legendary duo Kahneman and Tversky proved that just by framing a choice as a potential gain versus a potential loss, you could radically change people's decisions. And today, it's essential theory in communication science.
So we know a frame is a spotlight, but who's holding it? Who decides where to point it? How does one story, using the very same set of facts, become all about economic opportunity, while another becomes about environmental risk? Let's pull back the curtain and see how these narratives actually get built.
It really boils down to a two-step process. First up is frame building. You can think of this as the behind-the-scenes battleground, where journalists, politicians, activists, and corporations are all fighting to get their preferred angle, their spotlight, on the story. Then comes frame setting. That's when the winning frame gets presented to us, the audience, and it starts to interact with our own thoughts and beliefs. Let's zoom in on that first step, frame building, for a second. It's a real tug-of-war of influences. You've got internal factors, like a newsroom's own policies and values, like, say, a tendency to focus on conflict because it's more exciting. But then you have this constant push from the outside, from political campaigns, from PR firms, from social movements, all of them feeding journalists the story that they want to be told. It's a really complex dance.
All right, so the frame has been built. The story is out in the world. Now we get to the most fascinating part of this whole thing. What actually happens when that frame hits our brain? How does it work its magic on us?
Psychologically, it tends to work through two main pathways. The first one is really interesting. It's not about teaching you anything new. It simply takes a belief you already have. Let's say you believe economic growth is important, and it makes that belief feel like the most important, most relevant thing to consider when you think about a particular issue. The second path is a bit more direct. The frame just introduces a new fact or idea you hadn't thought about before, and you add that into your mental calculation.
And when that process works, when a news frame uses one of those pathways to successfully change how you think or feel about something, that right there, that is called a framing effect. That is the moment the architecture of belief has done its job and shaped your perception.
Okay, so we've gone through the what, the how, and the why. Now, let's turn all this knowledge into a practical toolkit. How can you start spotting these frames out in the wild and get a better sense of how they might be affecting you?
Which brings us to the big question, right? Are we all just puppets on a string here? Does framing affect every single person in the exact same way? Well, the research says not exactly.
It turns out there are a few key things that make us more or less susceptible. For instance, and this is wild, people with moderate political knowledge are often the most influenced. They know enough to understand the frame, but maybe not enough to really challenge it with other information. Also, people with a lower need for cognition, which is just a fancy way of saying people who don't really enjoy wrestling with complex problems, can be more susceptible. But the number one, most crucial factor? Resonance. A frame is at its most powerful when it connects with your deepest personal values. An argument framed around helping others will land hardest on someone who already deeply values compassion.
So I'll leave you with a little challenge. Think about the last news story you really engaged with today. An article you read, a video you watched, even just a headline you scrolled past. It wasn't just a pile of information. It was information presented inside a spotlight. It was designed, intentionally or not, to make you see the world in a particular way. So the real question is, can you see the frame now?